like most soldiers, I got sent to all sorts of different parts of the world. And for some weird reason, I kept getting sent out to these really rural posts, probably because I was a construction equipment mechanic in the Army. And I always ran into sheep everywhere I went. And it was kind of something that I joked with my friends about. It's like, I cannot get away from these meadow maggots. I never really felt a connection to any of the sheep until my deployment to Iraq. And over there in the northern part of the country around the town of Erbil, I ran into these beautiful flocks of sheep that had wool like nothing I'd ever seen before.
Raising sheep can be a hobby or a business, a joy or a trial. And with the right intent and actions, it can also be a powerful way to heal ourselves and our relationship with the earth. In this episode of Voices from the Field, Mickey Willenbring, a lifelong shepherd who raises Navajo-Churro and Karakul sheep in western Oregon, shares her shepherding journey and the deep wisdom she's gleaning along the way. In this conversation with NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Linda Poole, Mickey touches on the shepherding challenges of parasites, predators, and marketing. Come back next week for the second part of the conversation when Mickey will get into efficient ways to learn. Let's listen.
Hello, I'm Mickey Willenbring. I'm a veteran, a rancher, a mother, and a member of the indigenous agricultural community. I like to consider myself an agri-activist, which means that I advocate for food sovereignty amongst communities of color and poor rural communities in particular. I also advocate for fair and just treatment of not just the animals in the agricultural system, but also the land, the people, the workers, and the landscapes themselves. I come from a variety of different cultures. I'm multi-ethnic myself. I am most firmly involved with the Native American and North American indigenous cultures here in the US. I am Oglala, Lakota, and Zacatechas from and Ojibwe from my father's side. And on my mother's side of the family, we are a little bit of Middle Eastern and a little bit of Italian and a little bit of Taino. So while I have mostly grown up with my paternal family, I am learning to embrace my Arabic roots as well in my adulthood through the help of sheep.
Well, hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of She's Raising Sheep. I'm Linda Poole, a Montana-based shepherd and a grazing specialist with NCAT. And from that introduction, I know that you are going to be just as excited to hear from Mickey Willenbring as I am. The background that she brings to this conversation about women raising sheep is rich, it's diverse, and I think we should just go on from building on what you've had to say so far, Mickey. I'm so happy that you're here with us today.
Well, thank you, Linda, for inviting me here. I hope that all of your listeners are willing to forgive my awkwardness.
Well, I think that's something that a lot of us might share, Mickey. I should tell the listeners that I had the good fortune to meet Mickey earlier this summer at the Sheep is Life Festival in Arizona, in Window Rock, Arizona. And I just couldn't wait to be able to have you be able to listen to the wisdom that Mickey brings. And, I hear you already pre-apologizing for awkwardness, Mickey, but you bring such a wealth of information and such a valuable holistic perspective to raising sheep. So I wonder if you could talk with us, you said that, you're connecting to your heritage through sheep. What does that mean to you? Tell us about your flock and how does that work for you?
So to understand my connection to sheep, I have to kind of take you back on a journey. And in a lot of ways, I grew up in my family around a lot of very talented storytellers. So you might catch me telling things in circles. And that is just sort of the way that I was raised and the way that we bring things all the way around from you to us. So to really begin with sheep, I have to tell you that the upbringing that I had was not always with biological family. My parents were both part of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, and they were both motorcycle enthusiasts, and they were in a lot of ways outlaws of their time. Because of this, I was not always raised in one place, and I didn't really get the benefit of being able to set down roots in any one location. The one thing that did follow me through all of my lifetime was a really strange perforated dotted path that was tattooed by the hooves of sheep, starting from the age of 5 when I stayed with a family that raised horned Dorset sheep. And they gave me the task of taking care of the bummer lambs, something that I really identified with because they were lambs whose moms weren't able to provide them with the nurture that they needed. And they weren't quite accepted as part of the rest of the flock, and they didn't quite fit in with anybody, and no one really wanted to put up with their neediness. So that was something that at that age and with the family history that I had really resonated well with me. And going forward, I went through a number of different agricultural families and just kind of spending small amounts of time with each one, not really getting to stay long enough to build memories, but I always found ways to be useful to their agricultural operations because that was kind of a key to stability. Fast forward into my teen years when I was rebellious and I was like, I'm going to go out and see the world and explore all the cities and go in all these urban environments. And I was, a very typical rural kid, suddenly gone running wild. And after getting that out of my system, I went into the military as soon as I was old enough because I really needed stability. When I got into the military, like most soldiers, I got sent to all sorts of different parts of the world. And for some weird reason, I kept getting sent out to these really rural posts, probably because I was a construction equipment mechanic in the Army. And there's really not a lot of heavy engineer battalions in the military. And I always ran into sheep everywhere I went. And it was kind of something that I joked with my friends about. It was like, I cannot get away from these meadow maggots. I never really felt a connection to any of the sheep until my deployment to Iraq. Sorry, guys. I know that Americans butcher that name. And over there in the northern part of the country around the town of Erbil, I ran into these beautiful flocks of sheep that had wool like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was long, heavy, straight wool with like this dense outer coat that just hung down like streamers, and this inner coat that was tucked up inside of it that made them look like they were tufted all over their bodies. And they had tails that were bigger than a beaver tail. They were so wide and so thick and heavy with fat that when the sheep walked, their tails kind of jostled up and down like can-can dancers from behind. And they were funny looking animals to look at, but they were also deeply elegant. And for some reason, in that moment, I felt like, wow, this is something that actually resonates with me in a different way. These are not the fat, dumb, commercial bred sheep that die while lambing that I was raised around and had always been exposed to. These were more like deer, but they were still placid to their herders, even if they did like dip out and scatter when us soldiers came roaring through there. And I started talking to the sheep herders and was kind of appalled at the economics of how women and sheep were intertwined over there, but that's a whole nother section. And at some point in all of this, I realized, I actually do miss sheep, and I actually do miss being around them. And something about being in such a horrendous situation where combat was all around us and I was a participant of, and I was watching civilization literally crumble. And the only solace that I found there was sitting with these sheep and just getting to borrow that solace from these herders who treated me, all things considered, wonderfully well, beyond phenomenal. And I think that's something that I've found in common with shepherds all across the world ever since. And so it was those sheep that made me decide that when I got out of all of that, I needed to have sheep again.
Wow.
Now I now know that those sheep were Awasi sheep and Karakul sheep. And I currently raise Karakul sheep that came into my hands kind of by a cosmic accident. And I found out recently that my mom's paternal family actually has a deep connection to Karakul sheep, and they earned their family name through an incident that happened while sheep herding. So complete serendipity all the way along the way. Mm-hmm. And then the other breed of sheep that we raise here, the Navajo-Churro sheep, we raise because of my son. I have a going on 19-year-old son. His father is Dene, or Navajo, and his father's family had Navajo-Churro sheep. I fell in love with them because, much like the Karakul sheep, they had this same sort of long, heavy, drapey wool and delicate legs and beautiful colors. And I started raising Navajo-Churro sheep in the first place to maintain paternal connections between my son and his paternal family.
Mm. What a powerful story, Mickey. It grabs my heart, and it echoes what I've heard from some of the other women that I've talked with in this series, of a feeling of really, truly deep connections. Some people just have that with sheep, and maybe they have it with, I don't know, dogs or cows or television shows. I don't know. I don't know how other people relate to that, but for me too, there is something about sheep. My heritage is Irish, and my ancestors had sheep too. And sometimes I wonder if it's not just all a circle, and that we add value to one another's lives over generations. Those of us who have this connection. It's not the only way to be part of raising sheep. You've been clear about that, how it was so different with the horned Dorsets. Or there was some difference than what you feel with your churros and with your Karakuls. I wonder, how does this perspective of everything that you've gotten from sheep, how does that inform what you do with your sheep and your agricultural business?
Well, I think to understand how we operate here at Dot Ranch you have to also understand that for us, we have more traditional, and by traditional, I mean traditional indigenous, not European traditional. We have, or Eurocentric traditional. We have more traditional views of all beings. And by beings, I don't just mean mammals, I also mean mountains and rivers and trees and rocks. We believe that all beings carry sacred energy inside of them that is connected and interwoven into all of the universe around it, and that humans are not separate from that. We don't stand outside the web of nature, so to speak. We are actually part of that. So if you treat one component of the universe unfairly or in a bad way, that's going to reverberate all the way through to every other organism and being that is part of cosmos. And not in like a karma, you ate that cow over there, so now you're going to get smashed by a semi truck on your way into town. But more of if you don't treat the trees fairly, if you don't replant what you cut down, you're going to lose the water. You're not going to get the fog in the morning anymore. Your soils are going to blow away, and your animals are going to get sick and they're going to die. And it's going to, you have to move in respectful ways. So even with the animals that I don't have personal ancestral connections with, like our cows, because we also raise cows and Navajo Angora goats and poultry and stuff. Even with those animals, we always keep in mind that we have to treat them and their place in the web around them with respect, which also means, like try to avoid overgrazing, try to manage sacrifice pastures in a proper way, and so forth. Like that is not just one organism, but how it interweaves with everything else. I hope that makes sense.
Well, it makes, back to use the word deep, it makes deep sense. And it's some of what we have to learn from indigenous cultures is the idea that we are all connected in a circle. Nobody is in the center of that circle. It's life, and we're all together in that.
Learn how to harvest the sun twice with practical information at NCAT's AgriSolar Clearinghouse. Get access to more than 400 peer-reviewed articles, the latest in agri-solar news, and connect with farmers and solar developers who are working together to make the most out of our shared resources. We'll see you at agrisolarclearinghouse.org.
I'm really curious, Mickey, you mentioned about not overgrazing and that you use a sacrifice pasture. Can you talk with us about your grazing management that you do with your sheep? Are you doing multi-species grazing? Are you doing some type of a rotation? How do you manage the grazing on your property there in Oregon?
So we currently have 158 acres of quote unquote privately owned land. And it is a mix of pasture and wetland and forest that we do maintain as commercial forestry land, which is, we basically are doing silviculture. So what we do is we rotate our animals through different zones on the property according to time of year. And what we're looking at is kind of a whole system maintenance. There are certain areas where we do not allow our domesticated animals to go, like the wetland. We have a irrigation slough slash creek slash waterway, which is sort of maintained. The water levels in it are kind of maintained by the water master for our county. There's always water in it, but it's not always available for agricultural use, for example. We do have a small amount of water rights so that we can irrigate one pasture where we can grow our hay. It's a 18-acre hay plot. We do have multi-species grazing management. We graze a very small amount of cows, typically no more than 6. We have usually, and these numbers fluctuate according to breeding season and lambing and calving and so forth, of course. But we have our core numbers are 6 cows max, usually 4, and up to 50 goats and up to 250 ewes. And it's not always at the max, and sometimes it's way over the max of those numbers if they have lambs at side. Again, I hope this is all clear to everyone. What we are trying to do is graze them in a way that we can mimic the use of fire on these landscapes. And to understand that, you have to understand that the traditional history of this land in particular was Kalapuya land. And the Kalapuya Nation used fire to maintain an oakland savanna ecosystem. And each year they would go in and use low intensity fire to clear out all of the undergrowth, to open up the seeds to the basket weaving plants and the medicine plants, to ensure that anything wasn't getting too big of a foothold in the area, and that the oak groves were nice and rich without the land becoming overly acidic from buildup of tannin off of the oak leaves. It was at one point when contact of European settlers first came here, they wrote of this land as being like a vast parkland with beautiful groves of oak trees and open grass and flowers and basketry plants all around under them, and game animals coming as far as the eye can see. And of course, some of those settler narratives are a little overly florid because they're trying to get more people to come settle. But it is generally recognized that that's a pretty accurate description of what Oakland Savanna looked like. And these areas were maintained not just for plant use for basketry, but also to maintain the game animals, the deer, the elk, the bison that used to range all across North America, and so forth. When these lands were settled and the Kalapuya were removed and shoved over onto the reservation near the coast, all of that was pretty well destroyed. Most of the oak groves were cut down, and when they cut down the oaks and killed all the beavers, the creeks all dried up and the land lost its arability. And they discovered quickly that the only thing that really grew in Oregon was trees. So it became timber country, and it was all planted with the timber that was wanted in the time period. So it went from cedar to Douglas fir and so forth. This property that we own was one of those places where most of the oaks were removed, and it was replanted with timber, and it was harvested and then replanted and harvested, and all of the topsoil disappeared during those years. And finally, it was opened up for settlement for homesteaders you're gonna crack up on this, in the 1970s. And at that point, it was purchased by a private person who put a series of houses up here, and we ended up being able to purchase it, in 2010. So the prior landowner had raised cattle and he had severely overgrazed everything, but the forest was in fairly good condition. Unfortunately, that's about when drought started to hit. And currently, our forest is in danger. We've lost a considerable amount of trees to beetle damages, and we've only been able to harvest them for firewood sales. And so we started grazing the animals in a way to try and restore the oak savanna ecosystem. So we do mob grazing. We have some permanent fencing, and then we do temporary cross fencing. We've tried a lot of different methods. We've tried electric netting and just straight electric line and so forth. And we've discovered that wool sheep, this breed in particular with the Navajo-Churro, they really don't care about electricity unless they've been freshly sheared. They're very well insulated.
Yep.
So currently we manage them in pretty much the same way that they would be managed in on the Navajo reservation in Navajo Nation, and that is I walk them out by foot every day, and usually one of us is with them while they're grazing in different areas, and we push the herd along with just kind of walking along with them and keep them moving really quickly across the landscape. And then they come in and they'll rest during the hot part of the day, and then they'll push themselves back out on the exact same route that I took them on in the morning. So I have to change their routes of where I take them each morning so that they don't hit one area too hard. And so it's really kind of a personal way of doing it. I wouldn't be able to do it if I weren't a full-time farmer. I would have to rely on fencing, but it also works because the majority of my breeding stock is sold back into Navajo Nation. So they come back knowing how to be herded, and it really works out for our family and clients.
Yeah, I so respect the work of Fred Provenza. Wrote the book, The Art and Science of Shepherding. And I think that it, especially with sheep, where people who don't know anything about sheep say they're, born looking for a place to die and dumb as a sheep, things like this, and all these derogatory terms. But what Fred talks about, I've seen with my sheep, and I think I hear you saying about yours, is the rich intelligence and the connection of the sheep to the land, especially if they're there through generations, and how you can, it's basically co-evolution. It's co-creating. It's the community involved with taking care of the landscape. And it's not the only way. It's not even the usual way that people manage sheep. But I see this emerging more and more as the strategy that's going to work for us as we face this really, tumultuous weather that we have going on, and the challenges that we have with markets shifting around us, the idea of low input relationships, so that you're not bringing in, you're not feeding a bunch of feeder lambs with imported corn, and like you, I'm sure I'm far behind you, but I am working on learning how to manage my sheep without electric fences, so that I walk my sheep out every morning, and I'm trying to learn to not bring them in every evening. I'm trying to. I'm having a hard time with that. I'm a little bit of a helicopter mom. It's like, okay, you have guard dogs, but there are a lot of coyotes out there. So I'm trying.
Well,
yeah.
I have to say that we bring our sheep in every single evening, and we would have no sheep if we didn't, even with the dogs.
Yeah, you're in a really predator-rich place there with the trees in Western Oregon. I lived there for a little while I was going to grad school, and bears and mountain lions and lots of coyotes and dogs. Geez,
yes,
there are just an awful lot of, it's not even feral dogs, it's people's pets that have,
Yep.
Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, they're wonderful little Spot and Fluffy when they're at home, and they get out with a bunch of sheep and they turn into werewolves. Yeah.
We also have theft, unfortunately. 2 years ago, no, 3 years ago now, at the height of the pandemic, lamb prices skyrocketed locally, and lamb was selling for $4.65 to $5.65 a pound on the hoof in the auctions.
Wow.
Somebody scoped us out, and the day after shearing, they stole an entire trailer load of our sheep out of one of the pastures that was near the road. And we had to really change how we did things after that. Now, after shearing, we keep the sheep up in areas that we can directly monitor that are not near the road, because we found out that this is actually really common in our area, that people will look for them to be freshly shorn and then will steal them. So human predators in that year took more than in the previous 4 years of other predators, which is saying a lot, because we have cougars and bears and lynx and other things that will take animals. We just recently lost my ram lamb from Irene Benali, and I'm so sad.
Oh no.
He got a young cougar, had to have been a cougar, snatched him out of the field and tried to jump the fence with him, and his horn hooked on the fence. So the little freaking jerk-faced cat ate the butt off of my ram and left him like draped for the fence with the freaking hindquarters gone and just the front of the animal and the horn still stuck on the fence. And I'm sorry, you might have to remove that off of this, but this is the real life of farming in wildlife corridors.
Yeah.
And it is pretty freaking heavy metal.
Yeah, well, it's such a challenge, especially when what you're trying to do with your operation there, Mickey, is to put back together an ecosystem that's been broken. And yes, predators are part of the ecosystem, but it's just like, how do we deal with it? And so with your guardian dogs and bringing sheep in at night, those are your strategies. And I'm sorry to hear that, because I mean, it's heartbreaking, and it always happens. The one that is taken is always the most expensive or rarest. It just happens that way. It happens all the time with me. When I used to have horses, it was always the most expensive horse in the pasture that ran through the fence and had a problem. But yeah, so that's how you deal with predators, and they are a big issue because you're on the west side and you do have some moisture there. Mickey, what about parasites? Do you have any internal parasite or external parasite issues with your sheep, and how do you deal with them if you do?
So parasites are probably one of our top problems here, and challenges. I should say challenge, not problem. We have both internal and external, because we live in an area that is especially dense for agriculture, and particularly for sheep and cattle. That means that everybody shares parasites, because even if you maintain clean pastures or attempt to, there's going to be deer that graze all along the way. And even though they might not be affected by X thing that they picked up in the pasture 6 miles down the road, they still pick it up and they still poop it back out. Mm-hmm. So another aspect of that is that parasite resistance to common antithelmic, I hope I said that word right, common dewormers is a major issue. because of the dense concentration of sheep and sheep owners here. Mm-hmm. So in our area, a lot of the farmers, much like everywhere, are older. And so they carry some of the older ideas of how to handle deworming, including deworming their entire flock twice a year with the same drug every single time. And what that created was a drastic resistance to ivermectin that happened in our area. And that was a real problem for us for a couple of years before we discovered Cydectin and Valbazin are also pretty effective with sheep, depending on what time of year, and off-label use. And I was still kind of having some issues. And then I went to a Farmer Veteran Coalition conference and I met Margot Hale and Coffee, who work for NCAT. And they gave a class about sheep and goat husbandry, and they brought up the use of CALP, which is copper oxide wire particles. Now, I'm a real skeptic. And so when I heard of CALP, my initial thought was, well, you're not supposed to give sheep copper. And they're like, no, this is a different form of copper. And I'm thinking, all right, I've heard a lot of things. I'm just going to go ahead and smile and nod. And then when I get home, I'm going to go on to JSTOR and I'm going to research this for myself. And I went and researched, and the research was pretty new and scant at the time, but it supported what they said, that the form of copper in the CALP is biologically unavailable to the animal. So it doesn't get absorbed in the animal's intestines and remains to make that environment no longer tenable for parasites without giving copper toxicity to the animal that's taken that medicine. And of course, goats being more resistant to copper than sheep, you can give goats twice the amount of CALP that you can to sheep. So I decided, all right, we'll try this on for size for 1 year. And if anybody dies, I'll eat them and I'll move on and I won't do it again. And so we administered the CALP to half of the flock because I didn't want to kill the whole flock. And I wanted some controls for this little test. That half of the flock that received the CALP did not need to be dewormed after the initial dewormer that they were given along with the CALP. And the other half of the flock definitely needed to be dewormed, a few times that year. And in our area, I might say this word, coccidia, is another issue that we have because of the moisture here. We are actually not that wet all the time because we're in the Cascade Mountain foothills, so it's a bit drier here than the rest of the Willamette Valley. But we do get a significant wet period where the parasites just party. And at that exact same time is when my ewes are heavily pregnant, and pregnant ewes, for some reason, always become more susceptible to parasites at certain parts of pregnancy. And it's a known thing. I can spell the word for it. I don't know if I can say it right, but it's peripartrin something missional.
Yeah, right. Partru. Now I'm having trouble. Anyway, it means right before they land. There's a rise in the problems with eggs and levels of internal parasites. Yeah. Peripartru and oh well.
Yeah.
You know what
there
we
we go. So we knew that, at the time of year when our ewes are the most vulnerable and also requiring the highest amount of nutrients is also the time of year when the parasites are the most freaking out of control, because you can't have it easy. You wouldn't be farming if it weren't challenging.
Yep. True.
So we are now believers in CALP, and we use it to great effect. And the years that I don't use it, or that there's a shortage and I'm not able to get all of the kelp boluses that I need, we notice a difference in the animals. And what we do notice, though, is that kelp does not do anything for an already out of control parasite problem. You still need to use a dewormer if your animal is really rugged, and then let them build up a little bit, give them the kelp, and you should be pretty smooth sailing after that. Another thing that we do for a parasite is we notice that some sheep are genetically, I don't know this because I haven't looked at their DNA, all right, but I suspect that some sheep are genetically more prone to be weak freaking puppies than other sheep. Yeah. And the ones that, if the dam and the lambs all seem to always need to be dewormed, we eat those. They'll taste fine. You know, we'll give them a smaller area to graze that hasn't been grazed by other animals, and fatten them up and call them for the good of the breed. Because with Navajo-Churro sheep and Karakul sheep both, those are rugged animals. They were not bred for the same sorts of commercial production that is common for the Suffolks and the Columbias and some of the fine wool sheep that are more lowland animals. These are animals that are prized for their ability to thrive in inimical landscapes. And so for my philosophy, that means that babying them along through repeated issues is breeding weakness in, not upholding the strength already existing within the breed.
Yep. Yeah. So much wisdom, Mickey. I heard three things that I would love to kind of amplify before we move on. And one is that Margot Hale and the ATTRA publication on kelp was helpful. There's so much good information that we will link to in the show notes for this, so people who are listening can easily find that. So that's one thing. Another is that you talked about an experiment. You didn't make a change with the whole flock and just like, okay, I think this is better. You made an experiment. And to me, one of the things I love about the way that you're running your program is you're bringing together the best of endemic, indigenous wisdom and design, along with the idea of adaptive management and learning from what you're doing right in front of you now. And I think that's how we all learn. And what is in front of us as a species, not just as shepherds, is, the future is looking way different than what the past was. But what we can carry forward from the past is a thought process, the principles. There are principles of how sheep work and physiology, and how copper works in the gut of a sheep to be able to do this if it's in the right way. So that's one piece of it. But just having that along with adaptive management is important. The other thing that I hear you talking about that I think is absolutely essential is culling and making decisions to create site adapted sheep. I mean, it's a recipe for profitability in the long run. It's also just a way to live a happier life. I always think about that line from Thelma and Louise, you get what you settle for. And every time I look at my sheep and I think, I love that sheep, and it's got this dinky little lamb this year. And so I'm going to give her one more chance. I always have a lot of really good sheep that I could keep, and making the decision based on, I just really love that sheep, I'll give her a second chance. It's like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I've learned that if I want site adapted sheep, I have to take those families, and I've seen it too, just like you say, it runs in families. the strength of the immune system and the adaptedness to the landscape that we're in. It's I don't know if it's all genetics or if it's epigenetics. I don't know how it happens. I just know that it happens.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.